So I want to start by addressing concentration gradient here. So what we're going to do is talk about the role of the concentration gradient in the diffusion of gases, and then the other factors we're actually not going to address until we meet in class. Okay, so let's take a look at the pressure gradients and how they govern the movement of our gases in various points in our respiratory and circulatory systems, okay? So that's what's shown in this diagram. Is it's showing PO2 and PCO2 at different parts in our respiratory and circulatory systems. And it illustrates the role that pressure gradients play in the movement of these two gases. Okay, so we're gonna start by looking at this point here, okay, the movement of gases into and out of our alveoli. So the exchange between our alveoli and the atmosphere. What you can see is that in the atmosphere, PO2 is 160 millimeters of mercury. In the alveoli, PO2 is 100 millimeters of mercury. So what we're going to have is oxygen is going to move down its pressure gradient from the atmosphere into our alveoli. Okay. Likewise, PCO2 in the atmosphere is 0.25 millimeters of mercury. PCO2 in the alveoli is 40 millimeters of mercury. Hence, PCO2 is going to move out of the alveoli into the atmosphere following its pressure gradient. Okay, so this is how we get oxygen into our alveoli, and this is how we get CO2 out of our alveoli. Similarly, if we look down here, okay, and we look at PO2 and PCO2 and the pressure gradients, those are governing the movement of gases here at the interface between our alveoli and our capillaries, okay? So the blood approaching the alveoli has a PO2 of about 40 millimeters of mercury. And then as we have already gone over, the PO2 in the alveoli is 100 millimeters of mercury. Hence, O2 is going to move down its pressure gradient from the alveoli into the blood. So that's how we get our blood oxygenated as it moves through the lungs, okay? Similarly with PCO2, the PCO2 of the blood approaching the alveoli is 46 millimeters of mercury. PCO2 in the alveoli is 40 millimeters of mercury. So CO2 is going to go down its pressure gradient. It's going to leave the capillaries into the alveoli, and that's how we're able to offload our CO2 into the atmosphere, okay? So I want to bring up this question here. See if it's a little bit of a tricky question. You're going to have to do a little bit of detective work to figure this out, but see if you can figure out what these values are, right? So what is PO2? What is PCO2 in the arterial blood? Okay, so this blood right here. So think about that for a moment. Okay, so you may or may not have figured this out, but hopefully after I explain it to you, it'll make sense to you. Basically, the partial pressures in the arterial blood are going to be the same as in the alveoli. The reason for that is that the blood, as it passes the alveoli, is going to equilibrate with the alveoli. Therefore, this blood is going to have these same PO2 and PCO2 values. And then from that point on, we don't have any further gas exchange. So we're going to have those same values down here, okay? Okay, so let's move on and take a look at the role of pressure gradients in moving our gases at the tissues, okay? So basically same principles, but I just want to illustrate what's going on here, okay? So the blood approaching the tissues has a PO2 of 100 millimeters of mercury, like we just went over, okay? The tissues themselves have a PO2 of about 40 millimeters of mercury. Therefore, when the blood comes to the tissues, oxygen is going to move down its pressure gradient into the tissues from the blood. So that's how we oxygenate our tissues, from our blood, okay? And then likewise, PCO2 of the blood approaching our tissues is 40 millimeters of mercury. The PCO2 in the tissues themselves is 46 millimeters of mercury. Therefore, CO2 is going to move down its pressure gradient from the tissues into the blood. And that's how the cells are able to offload their CO2, okay? And then again, that CO2 is going to eventually make it up to the lungs where it can be exhaled. All right, so I'm gonna ask you kind of the same question here, right? What do you think these values are here? So now that you've seen the reasoning from the first one, hopefully you can figure this one out. Take a moment. Okay, so these values are PO2 is, well, basically the values are going to be the same as the values in the tissues, right? So same reasoning as before. Our blood, as it moved past the tissues, it equilibrated with the tissues, so it took on those same partial pressures. And then from that point on, we don't have any additional gas exchange, so it's going to retain those same values for PO2 and PCO2. Okay. All right, so I want to show you this table from your book. It shows you the typical values for partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our alveoli and in our tissues. Don't worry about pH, okay? So these are the values. So PO2 in our systemic arteries is about 95 millimeters of mercury. I think of it as 100, but whatever, it's in that range, okay? PO2 in our systemic veins is 40 millimeters of mercury. PCO2 of our systemic arteries is about 40 millimeters of mercury. PCO2 in our systemic veins is about 46 millimeters of mercury. So I do want you to know these values, okay? And I also want to remind you that our partial pressures in the arteries are going to be the same as the values in the alveoli for the reasons I talked about before, because the blood passing the alveoli equilibrates with the alveoli, and we end up taking on those same partial pressure values. And then I also want to point out that the partial pressure values in the veins is going to be the same as in the tissues, because as we pass by the tissues, we equilibrate with the tissues and we take on those same partial pressure values, okay? All right, so I want to close this section by circling back to this slide. We talked about the various factors that affect diffusion across the membrane. This portion, this past little portion that we covered, really just focused on concentration gradient. Like I said, we will address the others when we meet in class.